Welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast.
Each episode you will learn something fascinating so you can bring big ideas to your small talk.
Your growth is our growth. Listening to these episodes, subscribing to our weekly newsletter, engaging our posts on social media, and sharing our show with your friends and family is deeply appreciated as we work hard to expand this platform. You can also visit our page at buymeacoffee.com to contribute what you think the show is worth.
To the folks who are taking this step, we can't thank you enough. Look for the link in our show notes for more details about how you can support and follow us.
And now, please enjoy this episode. Welcome to the 76th episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. Thank you so much for hitting play and spending time with us. It really is a humbling experience. We definitely appreciate your support. So our guest today is Dr. Ronald Purser, Ron for short. He lives in San Francisco. He's a professor in the College of Business at San Francisco State University. He earned his PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western, and he's been part of the cultural scene actually for a number of years, especially after his viral article, Beyond McMindfulness, which really set him up in 2019 to release the book that we're going to be talking a little bit about today, right here, called McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality. It was published by Repeater Books. Ron, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing space. We're really looking forward to this conversation with you.
No, thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. And by the way, we were talking about this offline a little bit, but shout out to San Francisco. Shout out to all the folks that are listening to us in San Francisco right now. That place is near and dear to my heart, really both of our hearts. Jay lives there right now. It's a city that I landed in on Halloween of 2013 from New Jersey. I spent 6 years there. It's where I got married. It's really where I broke through a lot of my comfort zones, and I really just enjoy that place. So I'm really, I love the fact that you're sitting in San Francisco right now.
Yeah, I love it here. I'm right on the ocean almost.
Nice,
beautiful.
Nice. Yeah, you're a little bit south, but we won't give the exact location.
Yeah. No GPS coordinates, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But shifting to thinking about the premise of your book, I think it's actually important to wrap it in the context of maybe your own life experience. You've been training as a Buddhist since 1981, and you're an ordained Buddhist teacher, which is important because now I'm really going to oversimplify your book, and I hope you can expand on it. But it's important because you're sharing the perspective that mindfulness and the business that's been built around it cleverly deflects real issues. And it also ties in Buddhism to try to appear, quote unquote, deep, when really that might be superficial. It's very surface level. And so mindfulness becomes this exercise which makes you turn inwards into your own personal well-being. Mindfulness makes you think that you too are wholly responsible, and you're responsible for digging out of whatever situation you're in, as opposed to exercising and looking outwards to see what, issues are that exist in society, to look where the imbalances exist and maybe try to figure out if we can balance those imbalances. So I really find that really interesting in the context of your experience as a Buddhist teacher and someone who's been practicing since 1981. But can you expand on the premise of your book a little bit? And maybe I missed something.
No, I think that was a very nice introduction. Thank you for taking the time to really study and read the book. And well, I think I wrote the book really not as a critique of mindfulness itself, actually. Although
Okay.
it may initially look like it, it's just completely lampooning mindfulness, but really more as an expose of how it became a commodified capitalist spirituality is the way I characterize it. So, and so it's, yes, on the surface, if you look at the very surface layer of what I call McMindfulness, it's sort of the most gross, the most crass sort of commodification of mindfulness in the marketplace. For example, there was some conference or some convention, I think, down in Los Angeles a couple of years back called the Mindfulness Exposition or Mindful Expo or something like that. And it was nothing but, just booths of people selling their wares. But that's just a really kind of just the surface level of the critique. So, I mean, mindfulness really caught my attention going back around 2010, 2012 or so. Interestingly enough, even though like you said, I sort of discovered Buddhism in my 20s and but it was really funny because it wasn't until like 2010 or so, I never even came across the word mindfulness. I guess because my tradition was more in the Tibetan and in the Zen traditions, where mindfulness per se is not really central to those traditions, even though they're doing practices that are based on mindfulness. So when I saw it become so popular around 2010, 2011, I started saying, well, now I'm starting to understand that mindfulness in early Buddhism was very, very central, the Theravada tradition of early Buddhism. And what we see now is the modernist version of mindfulness coming out of Burma and coming out of Thailand, that was exported in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and eventually found its way to the United States. So to make a long story short, I really have a deep appreciation for these traditions, but I was really kind of taken aback by the whole sort of rise of mindfulness as a commodified version of it in the marketplace. So that's why I really started to become interested in it. And I was really kind of puzzled because back in the 60s and 70s, really Zen was the real popular form of Buddhism back then, and everything was more like countercultural, anti-establishment, anti-materialist, the hippies. Even before that, the Beat generation was real interested in Buddhism. But it was very countercultural, so I was really baffled. I was sort of surprised by how it morphed, so quickly into becoming sort of this panacea for, overpromising and touting, all its benefits as a panacea or as a cure-all for just about anything. And that's what really kind of puzzled me and why I, really started to pay attention to it. And the more I did, the more I started to see it, emerge in the corporate world. And that's when I said, oh my God, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Because, I'm a professor of management, so I have a background. I used to do a lot of management consulting too over the years. And so I have a good feel for how consultants and how management trainers sort of retool themselves based on what's trendy and what sells. And I saw a lot of that happening in the corporate sector. And so, I started connecting the dots, and I basically learned a lot in the process. And so my book is really meant as, there's a lot of hype, the mindfulness hype. And I felt like in order to cut through the noise of all that, I really had to go really strong with a kind of a polemical style. And so I see it as a public intervention in a way. And it's an ideological critique more than anything else. So I'm really kind of critically questioning the hype and the exaggerated claims, exposing and trying to deconstruct the ways that it's been selectively appropriated, how it's kind of become refashioned into an instrumental technique for personal gain, and how it's also sort of appealed more to upper and white middle class sort of demographic, how it's become highly individualistic, kind of a do-it-yourself DIY approach. It kind of integrates itself within the whole sort of framework of the wellness industry and therapeutic culture in a kind of a widespread sort of way. So that was basically my impetus or my impulse for writing the book.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Jay, you might have a question. I was going to say, like, you mentioned 2020, 2010 and 2012 and how you started to notice it in the corporate sphere. Were you also noticing it within the academic sphere as well?
The academic sphere. I don't know exactly what you mean by that.
Like within like professors, were you seeing it at universities? Was it also it feels like it was infiltrating all parts of society. I know you mentioned corporate place specifically. I definitely want to dive into that. I think that's really going to resonate in terms of, people listening, diving into that. But I was just curious.
Well, yeah, I think from the academic side, that's actually a good observation because, it was around that time that clinical psychology was starting to do a lot of research on mindfulness. So you saw a lot of psychologists and academic medicine, behavioral medicine, a lot of interest in doing random controlled trials to look at the efficacy of various types of mindfulness interventions, so to speak.
Wow.
And so there was kind of a burgeoning of interest in the scientific academic communities. And that really became exponential in a short amount of time. And I think that was one of the key drivers for how it became so mainstream. Some people have called that the scientization of mindfulness, because now you have the arbiter of science, the legitimacy of science, to say that, the mindfulness works, science proves it, So
Right.
Once you have that stamp of authority, a legitimacy, then it's sort of signed, sealed, and deliver. It's an easy sell, especially when you're selling it to public sector, like such as schools, public schools, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was definitely the case. It was that was a trend that really kind of made sure that mindfulness became acceptable in secular society.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it seems like people were able to identify that there was a product here in mindfulness that could be commodified. They got the backing from the scientific community that they needed to actually productize it. And then it sounds like corporate America was very happy to embrace it because, as you talk about in the book, mindfulness for most people is sort of used as a kind of pacification of their inner frustration, of their anger facing the environment they're surrounded with, either at a professional level or at a communal level. So it seems like it kind of started as a product. It was just a business opportunity. And then it gained even more traction because people realized that it could be used as a sort of, as you say in the book, a kind of palliative measure to keep people docile in their current position.
Yeah, I think though that initially, I think mindfulness started out very modest in its initial phase, because if you go back historically to its roots, I mean its modern roots in terms of its its situatedness within the medical community. So I mean, it started in the basement of a hospital in Massachusetts with John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction approach, MBSR. So it started out very modest to offer an 8-week program to patients who were suffering from chronic pain and anxiety. They may have had physical conditions that they were seeking, drugs weren't helping them or whatever it may have been. And it went on like that for at least 10 years or so, I would say, maybe 15. But then, as we just talked about, as the scientific community latched onto it, and then as the media kind of also teamed up with all these vectors coming together, and I think one of the trigger events was public broadcasting, PBS. Bill Moyers had a special. I think it was in 1990. I can't remember the exact title of it. With The Healing Mind or something. And one of the segments was where Bill Moyers sat in on John Kabat-Zinn's course. And once that got out into the public, that sort of just then reverberated and got the word out. And suddenly, it started percolating. A lot of interest started occurring. So I think it was modest at first. It was, kind of confined to a medical setting. But once the spiritual entrepreneurs got a hold of it, as you were pointing out, it became a product. It became commodified. Then the genie's out of the bottle at that point.
Right.
Then, at least in the medical setting, there's some semblance of ethics. There's some sort of, do no harm sort of ethical commitment going on. But once it gets into the corporate setting, corporations, once it gets into the U.S. military, then, it's a whole different story at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's actually dive into that for a moment, because in your book, you mentioned that, quote, as a management professor and a longstanding Buddhist practitioner, I felt a moral duty to start speaking out when large corporations with questionable ethics and dismal track records in corporate social responsibility began introducing mindfulness programs as a method of performance enhancement. And so I guess pulling off of that, there's this element that you talk about in the book that basically mindfulness at work creates a situation where people are just better adjusted cogs. And so just trying to extrapolate that and pull some threads off of it, I'm wondering if we can actually talk about maybe the type of impact a mindfulness program in the workplace could be having or should be having. So like from your perspective, if you were talking to a founder of a company, they're 18 years old, they're just starting a startup, or if you were talking to the CEO of one of the largest firms, whether they're 18 years old or 60 years old, I'd be curious as to what you might want to share with them if they are considering implementing a mindfulness program, and if you think there might be alternatives to enhance worker performance in place of that mindfulness program.
Yeah, I could do that. But could I go back a few steps first?
Please.
Because I think we have to unpack this a little bit more.
Yeah.
When it comes to corporate mindfulness. And I think we could start with how I called into question really what I felt was the diagnosis, that the diagnosis just seemed a little too convenient for me. In other words, that the stress that people were experiencing supposedly had nothing to do with either their actual material conditions or the unreasonable demands that were being placed upon them in the workplace. Instead, stress was kind of framed as this private, subjective condition. Mm-hmm. In other words, the individual needed to take personal responsibility for the stress they were experiencing. And that's because it did come out of a medical setting, and because behavioral medicine is based on individual interventions. And it has a medical understanding of stress. It has a depoliticized understanding of stress as a biological, a source of stress is biological. So I felt that was a little too convenient. And when you kind of place the burden in the locus of control of psychological stress entirely upon the individual, what that does is it erases any questions of a larger diagnosis of what are the sources of stress besides just individual reactivity. If someone has, the way we respond to situations is our responsibility.
Right.
We can't rule that out, but there's a lot of other factors going on that cause workplace stress besides, the fact that, maybe I have an anger problem. Maybe there's a reason I have an anger problem in the workplace. I mean, now look at what's happened with the Great Resignation. Yeah. People have kind of wised up to the fact that, I kind of like the quality of life I have now by not having to drive, 60 miles in rush hour traffic and work 9 to 5. I'm more productive at home, So anyway, to make a long story short, the social and environmental factors that contribute to stress are sort of not part of the equation in the mindfulness industry, especially in the corporate mindfulness industry. So I really needed to challenge that dominant narrative that privatizes the causes of stress. And this is then how it becomes co-opted in a way, and how it can function as a form of social control, because by placing the burden squarely on the individual employee, it basically lets the corporation off the hook for any responsibility for the stressors that they are generating within their own corporate culture, for example. So that's one point I really needed to make first. And, this idea of privatization and how we privatize, even mental health issues have become highly privatized. And it's kind of a part of a whole historical trend of how capitalism has always kind of co-opted spiritualities and turned them into these highly individualistic forms, which are then accommodated to the dominant economic and values and corporate interests, so corporatized type spiritualities. So, a great example of this, one of the more recent examples, of course, you may have seen this in the media, is Amazon's working wellness program, which now is called AmaZen. Yeah. And there was quite a few articles out there about 3 or 4 months ago about this. And as we all know, Amazon has been putting, I don't know if you saw that, what was the British comedian's show who did a whole special.
John
Oliver's special on Amazon's anti-union campaigns. In fact, one of my colleagues at San Francisco State, he was some of his articles were quoted on that show, John Logan.
Oh, very cool.
But on the shop floor of these warehouses at Amazon, they have these little kiosks, these booths that are vertical booths. They kind of look like upright coffins. And so employees can go into these booths and they have these interactive videos, and you can kind of like take a 3-minute break and watch a mindfulness video and then go back to work. So,
wow.
Yeah. So to me, it was like, that was like AmaZen or whatever it's called is now like the new poster child for me for corporate mindfulness programs that exactly do what I'm talking about, how they place the burden on an individual and not address any of the systemic and structural factors that are causing stress in the environment.
Right.
So, but you're going back to your question. How can corporate mindfulness work? Can you rephrase your question for me?
Yeah, basically
so I get a better sense of it. Yeah.
Yeah, what advice would you give to someone who's either 18 or 57? They're leading a company, whether it's a startup or established, in place of a mindfulness program as a way to enhance employee productivity. What do you think is a better alternative to get employees to actually produce more efficiently and be happier?
Well, I'm not so sure I would support any of those
Okay.
postulates. Uh, this whole link between mindfulness and happiness too is something that I find troublesome. So
Let's poke holes.
Okay. But to be fair, let's try to think this through. I think that there are ways of what's the word? Rescuing. Maybe that's not quite the right word. Reforming mindfulness in corporate settings. Maybe? Salvaging, yeah. Reforming, revisioning. Yeah. That's a nicer word.
Yeah.
What are we really talking about, first of all, when we say mindfulness? I think that is such a general word in itself that we need to get clear on what that means and what that looks like, because it's too vague now. There's so many people bandying the word around. What are they actually doing when they're teaching mindfulness? What are they actually teaching?
They might be teaching awareness, like just the simple fact of awareness equals mindfulness.
Yeah, and so I think that we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is it we really are? What are we really trying to do? And what kind of company are you trying to create as a founder? And if I think it's going to tie back into your values as a founder. And but the problem we have with that, again, it gets back to almost like an economic institutional problem, is once a company goes public, you often see all those great ideas and humanistic values that the founder has kind of goes to the wayside, because now they're tied to a whole different set of expectations in terms of their responsibilities to their shareholders. So we have a system in place that, in effect, kind of ties the hands of even people who want to really do the best thing, and for public companies. But right. I guess, if you're a private company or you haven't gone public, you probably have a lot more autonomy and more degrees of freedom to do things that are not subject to that sort of co-optation, right? So I think we should look at it that way and be realistic about it. Because I've known CEOs or division managers who, really have supported some very humanistic programs, but boy, it's hard. It's hard if you don't have that champion there, or you have these other quarterly pressures. That these are some of these programs are the first thing to be cut in a corporate setting. I've seen that happen many times, and that's because our view of the organization is such that we don't see that it's a set of interacting forces between, for example, shareholders, customers, and employees. And each one of those triad of forces are pulling in their own directions. In other words, shareholders want to maximize their value. Customers want to maximize their value. They want the lowest cost, the highest quality, best service. Employees want to maximize their value. They want the highest salary, the best quality of life. And so they're all kind of pulling in opposite directions. There's tensions, and managers are then put in the middle of those tensions. And more often than not, they side with the shareholders because their bread is buttered by the people above them. And so how do you counteract these forces that are pulling in opposite directions? I think it requires a whole revisioning of how we conceive of organizations and their purpose in society, right? I mean, this is kind of the whole sort of deeper movement that I think we're up against with kind of the worst side of capitalism, in terms of what it does in terms of ravaging the natural environment, creating all these massive inequities. And so when you talk about mindfulness, you have to look at this much more complex set of systemic forces that are going on. And then kind of try to ask yourself, well, what can we do within the midst of these forces? And not to try to oversell it, right? And not to overpromise things, I think, too.
Yeah.
But I think on the ground, I think that mindfulness programs in a corporate setting should be integrated with an ongoing sort of commitment to corporate social responsibility, and that so there should be kind of a strategic level, and then an operational level of mindfulness that interact with each other. So that, for example, when you start training employees in mindfulness, part of that program would include kind of an organizational diagnosis of, okay, let's have a dialogue. Let's have kind of an inquiry into what's causing, what are the sources of stress in our workplace. Let's try to catalog those and diagnose the real root causes of those. And how can we link what we're doing with mindfulness to an organizational change initiative so that we can actually address those sources of stress in a systemic way and not just put the burden just on employees themselves, so it doesn't become this Band-Aid approach, this co-optive approach.
Right.
And that's kind of the advice. That's what I'd like to see. Also, like if you're in a service environment where what they call it emotional labor, where you have to kind of put on a smiley face all day.
Yeah.
In what you're doing, especially for facing the customer directly. There's been interesting research recently. I can't quote the exact article. I'd have to dig it up. But they found that by offering mindfulness programs to those sorts of employees, it actually caused more stress for them because they had to. Then they said, the way I get through the day, is, I really don't want to know what my real feelings are.
Right.
This is how I actually get through the day.
Yeah.
So don't make me more mindful right now. This is how I deal with stress. Yeah. So there's like these counterintuitive things that can occur that it's not just like one size fits all.
Yeah.
And
as you say, it's a Band-Aid.
Yeah. And the way I kind of read some of the big themes of the book, it's like mindfulness helps preserve the status quo by putting people in a position to accept the way things are now. So if the status quo, if we had all the bigger stuff figured out, the bedrock issues figured out, then there wouldn't be such a deception at play in the way that corporate organizations are pushing mindfulness as a positive, when in reality it's just reinforcing the same negative things that have been impacting our culture for decades.
Yeah, I know there's been some interesting studies too, like out of Stanford. I think I mentioned that in the book as well. Like, I think it was Jeffrey Pfeiffer, Stanford graduate business school. He did kind of a meta-analysis of what were the structural and systemic factors that were causing stress, workplace stressors, basically. And it came down to like unrealistic job demands, long work hours, bad bosses, lack of autonomy, not being able to make decisions, and in some sectors, lack of health care, fear of layoffs, job insecurity. And, you know, those are not individualistic psychological problems. Those are workplace problems. Those are structural problems of the corporation.
Yeah.
And so when you get people like some of these corporate mindfulness guys like David Vagelis, he wrote a book called Mindful Work. I always quote him because he kind of sums it up. He had a quote that said, it went something like, stress isn't something imposed on us. It's something we impose on ourselves.
Mm.
And you know, when you buy into that premise, then you basically have, like you say, you're basically promoting this co-optation and accommodationist orientation to the status quo. Because then you think stress is just something inside your head, and you know, it's a form of victim blaming at some level.
Right. Yeah.
It comes down to that at some level. I think that should be careful, because I'm also not suggesting that employees couldn't get benefit from individualistic mindfulness programs, or that people shouldn't take care of themselves, the whole idea of self-care. Because people do derive modest therapeutic benefits from mindfulness practices. So the thing is that it's not either or. You know, we have to look at both the individual and the environment. But the problem is we've kind of tilted the pendulum way over to the individual in our society, like we do with most everything else.
Yeah, right.
I liked your idea around trying to group an individual with an ongoing social responsibility from the corporate side as a way to kind of tie this all together, everyone moving in the same direction. But what I'm trying to think about is actually how mindfulness kind of hits on this element of posturing that takes place. When I think about mindfulness, I kind of think of maybe something like greenwashing that comes to mind. In your book, I was introduced to a concept called saffron washing.
Yeah.
So that was new to me. But my point is that, like, I'm observing that I think we're going into more of a society where it's really centered on posturing, and I could be wrong, but I'm curious.
Instagram kind of thing.
Yeah, and just like, you know, virtue signaling and all that stuff. And so I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are in terms of the potential. I'm asking basically, do you feel like we're in a culture of posturing? And if we are, what are maybe the second and third order of effects of that type of culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've talked about that. I have a colleague, Andrea Jane, and I interviewed her on my podcast too. Her book is Peace, Love, Yoga, The Global Politics of Spirituality. And so she looks at more at yoga. You know, it's very similar. She's kind of doing the same thing in her book that I did with McMindfulness. And she actually uses the term neoliberal spiritualities, which I think really kind of gets at it. But she made the point that, you know, this kind of spirituality, whether it's mindfulness or yoga, in terms of this virtue signaling, it's kind of performative politics in a way, the way she characterizes it. That, you know, if I buy something that, you know, has some sort of green certification or whatever, then, you know, I'm being political, you know. Look what I got. I got my little bag here. It's made with organic products or whatever it might be. And I think that also you see that a bit with, you know, with in the mindfulness circle. I'm more cynical and much more kind of cynical about more of the fake almost like persona that people take on with mindfulness. It's almost like there's this kind of like narrow bandwidth of acceptable behavior and emotional range, that you have to abide within. And I've been to mindfulness conferences, and I'm like, what is wrong with these people? I mean, I won't use any
character.
It's
like very placid, very tame. You're saying.
I would love to see Larry David walk into a mindfulness.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that'd be hilarious.
I mean,
it could be an episode.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of
No, but on that, actually, it's interesting because maybe you can talk about how you've seen mindfulness coaches, let's just say, for lack of a better word, basically give a pitch to companies. And in those pitch decks, you often see a lot of the same slides, and they try to wow you with images of the brain, but that's not really true. And so maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the spiritual entrepreneurial marketplace of ideas where it's mostly glitz and slick kind of presentations. Yeah, I think I mentioned that one of the cases is that I went to this workshop that was actually pitched as, here's how you sell corporate mindfulness. And so, I went in there and, okay, let's see what he has to say. And I was just stunned, in terms of the corporate speak, kind of the very deliberate strategy to disguise what you're doing, to kind of change the language. In fact, he kept going on about, it's all about the language. It's all about the language. Don't even use the word mindfulness. Like, wow. And there's some other consultant, and I don't know if you're familiar with Aristotle's, approach to persuasion, but, you tell a real emotional story and you get people, to empathize with that story and show a few slides of the brain. Here's your brain on mindfulness, and a couple fMRI slides with a lot of colors of the brain lighting up. Right. And before you know it, you've sold it.
Yeah.
That's pretty cynical, but it's part of the game. It's part of the consulting game of marketing.
It's part of the game too, because the person that's receiving this information many times don't even know what to look for. So those slides look really appealing. And so that is part of the game, just knowing who your audience is. And they don't even know what to look out for.
Yeah, that's true. Buyer beware. It's true that, if you're a complete newbie, you don't have a baseline from which to judge. So, and that's why it's so popular. It's easy sell. It's a very easy sell. It's a $2.2 billion industry. And it's, that should tell us something that, and so it's speaking to a need too. We can't just blame it all on the entrepreneurs. And what is that need? We should be asking that question, and how can we address those needs in a way that might be a little more responsible, and rather than just, capitalize on people's, ignorance or naivete, right?
Yeah.
I think we do have a need in our society. We're a very divisive society right now. We are experiencing a tremendous uncertainty at a juncture in our history right now. And we do and have been sensing that material wealth does not satisfy our deepest needs. So we have some deep knowledge that something is missing, and that hole is quite gaping. It's a gaping hole, and it's easy to manipulate people it's easy to fool people into saying, well, if you buy X, Y, and Z, that hole will be plugged up. And oftentimes it's not. And that's why, the wellness industry, you can never be too well in the wellness industry. There's always something else that's going to come along and, give you something better. And problem is a lot of these techniques, and they are techniques, basically appeal to our desire and our need for certainty. And in a way, they're kind of a mechanism to protect ourselves. And so a lot of mindfulness practices are used in a way to offer some sort of palliative, temporary relief that we really, we're desperate. And so it provides that sort of temporary quick fix of reducing anxiety, but it doesn't get to the deeper question I was talking about. Why do we feel such a deep lack, right? Why are we so insecure as a species? We have a sense that something's not quite right. And it's almost that our models for knowledge and how we produce knowledge are so outward oriented. We're very good technologically. We're very good at coming up with material goods and advancements in our standard of living but there's something missing in that whole picture there that we can't quite put our finger on.
Right.
And religions, the institution of religions is no longer viable. It's no longer speaking to us. So that's not on the table anymore. And it's almost as if politics has taken over religion.
It's really
politics is our new religion.
Right.
For sure.
People are so passionate about, nobody's cared about the news or politics before. And now, it's almost like a jihad in our country. And so, again, we can't seem to find, the diagnosis seems to be flawed, number one, and we can't seem to put our finger on what it is we're really looking for. But we know we're missing something.
Yeah, you use that word lack, and I actually wanted to read a quote from Eckhart Tolle that I read actually after reading your book. And I was kind of a fan of Eckhart Tolle prior to reading your book, but some of the ideas that you shared really helped me look at his language through a very different lens. So I'll read the quote here. If the thought, whether it be money, recognition, or love, has become part of who you think you are, you will always experience lack. Rather than acknowledge the good that is already in your life, all you see is lack. And, I actually want to use this term that the philosopher Dan Dennett coined, which is called a deepity. So I think that is squarely, fits in the definition of Dennett's idea of what a deepity is. So it's a phrase that seems true and profound, but is actually ambiguous and shallow. And the distinguishing feature of a deepity is that it has two possible interpretations. So on the first reading, a deepity is true but trivial. That's kind of the Trojan horse that serves as the vehicle for the second reading, which is false, but would be mind-blowing if it were true. And that second reading is where the bullshit kind of gets smuggled in. So like on the first reading of Tolle's statement, don't focus on the lack, because if you do, all you'll ever see is lack. Okay, that's true. It's kind of tautological, but it's true. But the second, more profound reading really is, regardless of whatever lack you face, look away from it, because if you focus on the lack, that's all you'll ever see. And that would be nice if the world worked that way, but it doesn't work that way. That's kind of bunk advice. We're flesh and blood creatures. We've gotten this far by facing our lacks and, facing those most fundamental hungers and satisfying them. So I think it's important. I think that was just an interesting quote that helped me see what you were talking about in terms of the superficiality of some of these ostensibly like deep statements.
Yeah. I've never been a fan of Tolle. And I remember trashing him on Amazon a long time ago. But yeah. Maybe another way of thinking about this too, in terms of mindfulness, and maybe it's similar to Tolle, is that some mindfulness programs, a sleight of hand kind of occurs. And what I mean by that is, have you heard of the term iatrogenesis?
I have not.
I have
It's
not.
a new one to me.
Iatrogenic. Yeah, it's a term in medicine where the cure itself is a problem. And I kind of see that in a way. And we've been talking about it somewhat in terms of the poor diagnosis and how we misdiagnose the cultural problem as being nothing but individualistic problem of maladaptation, and stress is kind of located completely within the individual, the source of stress. And so that leaves the larger social and political and economic systems under critiqued, right? And so in that case, we kind of obscure the deeper layers of society, and that's how it can kind of mask the problem, and that's what I mean by sleight of hand. It says, okay, you're the problem, the individual. We kind of do this kind of sleight of hand, and we kind of offset the systemic and social factors to point the finger more at the individual who's the problem. So self-care, I think it can be a radical act, but until we kind of also take into account others, and we take into account structural and social and political dimensions. In other words, a global knowledge of the problem, not just an individualistic approach. But yeah, I think these sorts of new age sort of trivial points are just not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic about the future, Ron? Do you see society going in a different direction than it has over the last 50 years since the 60s and 70s, when the wellness movement really kind of started emerging?
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, I don't know if I should make this point, but I've been telling a few other people about this lately, that back in, I think it was 2000, I actually read this book. Now that it's become popular, it's actually been appropriated more by the right wing, which is unfortunate. But have you heard the book, The Fourth Turning?
I have heard of the title. Yeah. I've not read it.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know. I haven't done my research lately on it, but evidently I think Steve Bannon.
That's where I heard it. Yep. I heard it in association with his name. Yeah.
Okay, that's too bad. But I think it's a really good piece of work, and they're social historians, and they basically looked at these patterns in history going way, way, way back. But they're focused more on American history, and so we've been in a period of what they call the unraveling period, about 20 years. Basically, when culture just becomes so polarized. But anyway, it's based on these 80-year cycles, and each generation is about 20 years or so. And we're entering the crisis period. And these cycles repeat throughout history. So, for example, when we were in the 60s, during the hippie generation, and rock and roll and LSD was on the scene, we were in this a whole different period, right? A whole different period of awakening is what he called it. So I think we're in for some tough times, I think, the next 20 years. So maybe, well, okay, maybe 2042 I'll be optimistic.
Hmm.
We have something to look forward to.
I gotta make it till then.
Me too. I hope so. I think a lot easier for you two than me.
Yeah.
But I'm trying my best.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
have to
no,
learn
because
more
I
about
was
that
also
book.
I was also trying to understand, like, what would change the pace of this mindfulness movement? What would, and to Jay's question, like, are you more or less optimistic about the future? But yeah, I think you just addressed that.
Well, I don't know. I think what's interesting about the COVID shutdown and what that's done, I think people have become a lot more attuned to their values and what they don't want to put up with.
True.
I mean, not everyone has that luxury, but many people have come to kind of a reckoning with that. No, I'm not going to go back to work. I'm not going to go to that place anymore. I've got other options. I think that labor now is in a position that has some leverage. And I hope that, we can take advantage of this situation to place the demands on the workplace to change their ways for a change. You guys be more mindful. It's on you guys for a change. Don't tell me to work 9 to 5. I could do my work in my own time, my own hours. I'm more productive without having to come to the office on a strict schedule. So we could take back, our rights in some ways, in that respect. So I think that's one positive thing I see coming out of this COVID pandemic. What else? What else did you ask? I'm sorry.
Oh no, I think you covered that. But in terms of, just other things that we could talk about, in the book, you talk about mindfulness in schools, you talk about mindfulness in military, which I found really interesting. Because I think your grandfather also served in the war, so thank you for his service. But I found it interesting having mindfulness in the military. I don't know if you want to expand on that, but basically, like, the fact that you have warriors that could be improved warriors, basically, which I find interesting in the concept of war. But really, something you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting or conversation, you mentioned how, like, there's this exaggeration of this kind of mindfulness playing itself out in the upper white middle class sphere of people. What did you actually mean by that? Like, what would you rather it be other people are experiencing mindfulness? Like, what were you trying to say there?
Oh, I think what I was trying to say in some respects was that the people who spearheaded this whole movement had the cultural and political capital to gain entry into the major institutions where mindfulness has been able to take root. And the way they did that was not by challenging those institutions, but by cooperating with them. So there's a book called The Mindful Elites by Jamie Kuncinskis, who's a sociologist, and she basically tracks the whole process by which the mindfulness movement was able to penetrate, like, schools and corporations and government, and it had to do with having those connections, having the cultural capital to gain entry, and so the promise was, or the logic was that, okay, once we sprinkle a few seeds of mindfulness in these places, such as the corporation, then eventually we'll see this kind of transformation of, for example, the corporation into a more social and environmentally responsible company. So we just need to kind of at least get mindfulness started, get it planted, get it, embedded, and by training managers over time, we'll see this kind of real transformation in thinking and policies and everything like that. And I call that the Trojan horse, promise of the Trojan horse. Of if we just, once it's subversive, they saw what they were doing as subversive by gaining entry, and then thinking, if we give mindfulness, for example, to Monsanto executives, that over time Monsanto will now, stop producing these toxic chemicals, or stop, ripping off farmers in India and saying you can't have these seeds because these seeds are, under our patent. They think that all these kind of, pursuit of corporate profit, maximization of shareholder wealth will suddenly, transform by giving people mindfulness. And you see that even more so, mindfulness has become so popular that it was they were invited into the World Economic Forum at Davos, Switzerland, which is the mecca for corporate moguls and heads of state. It's the rich of the richest kind of meeting. And open arms to mindfulness teachers at Davos.
Right.
And unlike who's the author of Humankind, the book Humankind, the Dutch, what's his name? Oh, God, I can't think of his last name now. But he was invited there. And he basically told them off. He said, "How come you guys aren't paying taxes?" To me, that was the most mindful teaching that was ever given at Davos when he made that statement.
I think you're talking about Bregman.
Yes. Yeah. Bregman.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, no, and just in terms of why I was thinking the military and the mindfulness connection was important, not only because your uncle was in Vietnam, but just I know, according to your book, you write that you believe every effort should be made to ensure that soldiers and veterans receive the best available medical and psychological treatments for PTSD. How do you feel we're making progress on that?
I really couldn't tell you. I'm not up on what the VA is doing. But yeah, I was very critical of that whole movement within the military, of training people, training soldiers in. I was more critical towards the pre-combatant training. In other words, they were training soldiers before they were deployed to Afghanistan to use mindfulness, quasi mindfulness practices on the battlefield, so I saw that as basically the most sort of instrumentalization of mindfulness that you could find an example of, in terms of separating it from the ethics of nonviolence, which mindfulness has always been embedded in. And so it basically became weaponized in a way in pre-combatant training. And I don't even really see what they're doing as mindfulness. I think it should be called attention enhancement training, because that's basically what it is. Yeah. And they, if you look at some of their own documents, they call it optimizing warrior performance, and enhancing the cognitive capabilities of soldiers. And the military will invest in anything that optimizes warrior performance. I mean,
Yeah.
and so, there's really no questioning of the ends or the interests that these techniques serve. And again, it places the burden on the individual soldier. The individual soldier must learn to manage their own stress, just like the individual employee in the corporate workplace. And they're commanded. I mean, by command, they have to do what they're told. And so, it's just the same thing. It's mindfulness in the military is not going to address, it's not going to prevent preemptive wars or moral injury or cultural trauma. And I don't think that means that we should just jettison these techniques. Like I said, I'm not against mindfulness for people with PTSD. That's a whole different thing.
Right.
But to use it as a weaponized system is a different use of mindfulness, I think. And I really excuse the pun, but I took aim at that approach.
Nice. That's amazing. Yeah. No, this it's been a great conversation. I know we're a little bit over the hour, and I actually feel like we could do a whole round 2, because I know that outside of writing a book and teaching, you also, or being a professor, you also teach courses that engage people in deep and sometimes really new kinds of inquiry, and you explore space and time and knowledge and that connection. And so I think we could have a whole separate conversation on that, but I find what you do with that really interesting, because it's in a way focused on coping skills. And I feel like I know I could be better at coping skills. I feel a lot of people can be better at coping skills, but coping with life, coping with grief, coping with other people dealing with grief. I mean, there's just so many elements to coping that I find interesting, that I think your other work hits on, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah, I'm teaching now at Dharma College in Berkeley, and I'm an associate instructor there now. So, yeah.
Congrats. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, it's been great, Arjun and Jay. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Before we wrap, though, one last question we ask everyone.
Okay.
If you could be any animal for a day, what would you be and why?
I have to be a dog.
We've been getting that answer a lot recently.
I mean, my dog has the life, and if I had to be reincarnated, I would definitely want to be a dog with a good owner.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah. That's a big caveat. That's for sure.
A good owner.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Or someone could rescue me. I'd be fine with that too.
Yeah.
Nice. Love that. No, Ron, appreciate the time. Appreciate the contribution. I encourage folks to go pick up McMindfulness, get a different perspective on mindfulness, and hopefully we can do another round in the future.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
All right. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglaterally.com.
Thank you.